Imagine a warm afternoon. The air is sweet with green sap and sun-warmed earth. You walk past a row of trees and catch a glimpse of a three-lobed leaf, bright as a child's drawing. Somewhere nearby, a pot is simmering. A woman pinches a coarse brown powder between her fingers and drops it into a gumbo pot. A child pops a frosty glass of root beer, and the first sip floods memory. Winter fairs, candy-striped wagons, the fizz tasting somehow like home. That smell, that taste, that tiny brown leaf, once threaded through kitchens and scrubbed into teeth, came from a single genus of trees, sassafras. There was a time when one tree shaped so much of American childhood that its absence feels like a theft. Then, almost overnight, it disappeared from our cabinets. The story begins long before the colonists, long before commercial bottles and patent medicines. For thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of what we now call Eastern North America knew sassafras intimately, its shapes, its seasons, its remedies. Tribes such as the Choctaw and Cherokee, Tamukwa or Timucua, and the Nipmuc used the plant in ways that were practical, ceremonial, and culinary. Roots were brewed into decoctions for fevers. Leaves were crushed and applied to wounds. Bark was chewed for dental care. The dried, bruised leaves were pounded into file powder, a coarse seasoning that thickened stews and became the backbone of Creole gumbo long before gumbo entered the national menu. This was not an accidental, marginal plant in indigenous life. It was a living technology, medicine, spice, tonic, and a daily smell in fireside kitchens. When Europeans arrived, they quickly recognized sassafras as something special. Early explorers and traders described a fragrant root said to cure a host of ailments, scurvy, melancholy, what they called consumptions. News traveled across the Atlantic. European physicians and apothecaries prized the bark and root as a new colonial remedy. Merchants loaded ships with peeled roots and slabs of bark bound for London and Lisbon. For a while, sassafras was money. It became part of the imperial exchange, one of the new botanical treasures of a continent. The demand was enormous, and the technique used to harvest that treasure was brutal. Bark stripping kills trees. Whole groves paid the price for a remedy and a seasoning that European markets and colonial markets suddenly desired. Despite heavy exploitation, sassafras was resilient. The trees re-sprout from roots and spread from seeds, and so they never truly vanished from the landscape. But their social presence, the way they lived in kitchens, in the bones of home recipes and seasonal rituals, changed. By the 19th century, sassafras had graduated from folk remedy to national flavor. It became the essential note in homemade root beer, that amber, foamy childhood drink. Pharmacists and entrepreneurs packaged root beer as a temperance-friendly alternative to alcohol, an aromatic, spiced soda that tasted of turf and bark and memory. Charles Hyers, a pharmacist in the late 1800s, is often credited with popularizing a commercial version of root beer that brought the flavor into mass-produced beverages. In parlors and parlors on wheels, in penny candy stores and backyard vats, sassafras was part of the ritual of growing up. Regional foodways wove it elsewhere. In Louisiana kitchens, a pinch of file, ground sassafras leaves, gave gumbo its velvet body and a faint herbaceous note that was as much identity as seasoning. In the South, sassafras tea was a spring tonic, a ritual of renewal. Families tucked dried leaves into drawers to scent linens. Grandmothers chewed parts of the plant to clean teeth. It became, in a very real sense, part of the palate of a nation. Then came a different kind of chemistry. Scientists isolated a molecule abundant in sassafras oil and gave it a name, saffrole. It is a fragrant, flavorful compound. What gives the root that distinctive, slightly peppery, slightly balsamic edge? Saffrole is also chemically active, and in the mid-20th century, laboratory studies reported that rats fed concentrated saffrole developed liver tumors. Those findings were a jolt. Regulators looked at the data and asked whether that same compound should be allowed in foods and drugs sold commercially. In 1960, the Food and Drug Administration moved to remove saffrole from allowable food additives. The ban was later codified in the Code of Federal Regulations, see 21 CFR 189.180, for the product-level rule banning sassafras oil and saffrole as direct additives to foods. But the laboratory result is not the whole story. Context matters. The doses that produced tumors in rats were large and involved concentrated saffrole delivered repeatedly over time. Translating animal studies to human risk is never straightforward. The amounts of saffrole a person would ingest from a cup of traditional sassafras tea or a sprinkle of file in gumbo are tiny compared with the lab exposures used in those experiments. To paraphrase the way toxicologists put it, the dose makes the poison. In other words, you would not get the same exposure from ordinary culinary use as the rats received in the lab. At the same time, regulators had to weigh uncertainty, the precautionary principle, and the goal of protecting public health across a population. There were other elements at play. Saffrole is not just an innocuous flavor compound in the eyes of law enforcement. Chemically, it can be transformed into substances that have been used as recreational drugs, MDMA, and related compounds, and by the 1970s and 1980s, those synthetic drugs attracted the attention of new enforcement priorities. Saffrole, when concentrated and diverted, became a potential precursor in clandestine syntheses. As a result, the conversation shifted from food safety to supply control. The Drug Enforcement Administration and international customs agencies began to treat saffrole and large shipments of sassafras oil with suspicion. Shipments were seized, arrests were made. In one well-publicized instance, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police intercepted a shipment of sassafras oil that investigators linked to diversion for illicit synthesis. Details on the year and shipment specifics are indefinido in some sources. The effect was immediate and practical. Commercial companies reworked formulas, flavor houses turned to synthetic substitutes or saffrole-free extracts, and mainstream food manufacturers largely abandoned natural sassafras oil. The combination of regulatory prohibition on commercial additives and the association of saffrole with clandestine drug manufacture produced a peculiar cultural result. Even where the trees grew thick and free, along hedgerows in old fields marking fence lines, the culinary use shrank. Recipes that had passed from mother to daughter were shortened or altered. File began to disappear from spice racks. Root beer bottles changed their ingredients lists. The plant did not die, but its role as a touchstone of domestic life did. What does it mean practically to say the tree vanished overnight? It is an image, but not a literal one. The disappearance was social and commercial and remarkably fast. One generation remembered the scent of sassafras, the next saw empty shelves where a familiar bag of file might have been. Childhood tastes were reformulated not by nature, but by policy and market response. The disappearance was a kind of erasure. Knowledge, ritual, little recipes that once stitched a community together were lost as producers removed ingredients, as the new legal and policing regimes stigmatized a once common plant. There is a tension here worth holding. On one hand, public health agencies confronted a plausible hazard. Animal studies suggested risk. On the other hand, law enforcement concerns about precursors and the political climate around drug control amplified the move from cautious regulation to near-total commercial exclusion. Motives were mixed. Public safety, scientific caution, economic calculation, and enforcement priorities all converged. It would be simplistic to say any single actor intentionally erased a cultural practice. The truth is more complex. A confluence of science, policy, and fear remade what was acceptable for public markets. Still, people did not entirely give up. Sassafras trees persisted wherever their roots could reach light. Foragers, herbalists, and cooks kept small, private uses alive. There is a remake of tradition in pockets. A forager who brews a small batch of tea in the backwoods. An elderly cook who still stores a pinch of file in a tin. Artisanal producers who sell saffrole-free sassafras extracts and flavorings labeled as sassafras flavor, made without the banned oil. The law is also textured. Personal possession and foraging for private use occupies a different legal space than large-scale commercial sale or the export of concentrated oils. The nuance is important. What you can do in a backyard boil is not the same as what a multinational food company can put into a product. There is a chemistry lesson here that's easy to understand without a lab. Think of saffrole as a powerful note in a palate. In tiny doses, it's a flavor, an aroma. In large doses, it's biologically active in ways we don't always fully understand. It also happens to be transformable into other compounds in the hands of a chemist. That double nature, delicious and potentially dangerous, made saffrole an awkward object for regulators. Their decision did something practical. It removed an ingredient from mass production, but it also did something cultural. It made part of a shared sensory life disappear. The economic ripple was swift. Companies that had built beverages and confections around that flavor either reformulated or left the market. Entrepreneurs who might have taken file and bottled it for a national audience found a cold marketplace. The kind of small-scale, artisanal commerce that could have preserved and transmitted recipes weakened under the weight of liability, supply chain scrutiny, and shifting consumer expectations. The loss of an ingredient is also, often, the loss of the story that goes with that ingredient, who taught you to use it, why you use it, the seasonal rituals that accompany it. If you talk to botanical historians or ethnobotanists today, they'll point out how common this pattern is. Plants that are woven into daily life can be unmoored by a single regulatory decision or a technological change. Sometimes the plant vanishes because its habitat is destroyed. Sometimes because it becomes associated with a larger legal or medical issue that stigmatizes it. Sassafras is a classic case of both resilience and fragility. The species survives in fields and hedgerows, and yet a layer of tradition around it was peeled away within a human lifetime. There is a human cost to this kind of erasure. File powder is not just a thickener, it's a repository of taste, an index of memory. To lose it is to lose names, to lose jokes, to lose a particular rhythm of seasons, the spring of new leaves, the autumn blaze of three-lobed color, the winter of sipped teas. For some indigenous communities, it is another instance of a life-sustaining knowledge being sidelined by the same forces that have sidelined so much traditional practice: commodification, appropriation, and then legal exclusion. At the same time, the contemporary picture is not monochrome. There is a revivalist energy in some quarters. Ethnobotanists are recording stories. Museums and archives are digitizing old recipe books. Food historians unearth a jar of file in a long-forgotten trunk and set out to recover that taste. A few flavor houses produce saffrole-free extracts that capture a hint of the original, and some small producers advertise sassafras flavor, saffrole-free, in polite parentheses. People interested in culinary heritage can still find traces if they look with sensitivity and a care for legal boundaries. The debate around saffrole also shows how science and policy talk past one another at times. Animal studies raised red flags. Regulators responded to uncertainty. Law enforcement reacted to diversion risks. Markets adapted. Citizens adjusted their home practices. Each step had its own logic. What was perhaps less obvious at the time was the cultural velocity of that adaptation, the speed with which popular practice shifted from knowing to not knowing. That forgetting may be the hardest thing to recover. So what can be preserved? Knowledge first. Ethnobotanical records, written accounts, interviews, herbarium specimens are inexpensive ways to keep a plant's story alive. Teaching matters. A single cooking class that demonstrates file, explains its origin, and then models a legal, safe alternative keeps more than a flavor alive. It keeps a memory. Stewardship matters. Conserving woodland patches and allowing sassafras populations to regenerate ensures the botanical future matches the cultural one. And legal clarity matters. Distinguishing between personal, low-volume uses and commercial distribution helps people know what is permissible and what is not. We should also recognize that the disappearance of sassafras from mainstream use is not merely a tale of restriction. It is a reminder that tastes and traditions are fragile, and that modern regulatory systems and market forces can swiftly realign what is ordinary. That can be protective, and it can be impoverishing. The task, if there is one, is to learn from both sides, respect public health concerns, preserve the stories and practices that make life meaningful. It is possible to imagine a future where the smell of sassafras returns, in a limited and carefully contextualized way, to public life, in educational workshops, in protected culinary heritage programs, in museums of regional foodways. It is possible, too, that the tree will remain mostly a wild note in hedgerows, sustained by hobbyists and those who remember. Neither outcome erases the irony. A plant that flavored growing up for generations is now a teaching moment about how quickly cultural knowledge can be shuttered. If this story has stirred your curiosity about lost natural histories, subscribe. There are more vaults to open. In the meantime, the next time you see a three-lobed leaf along a fence line, pause, smell it if you can, and imagine the sound of a spoon on a ceramic bowl, a child's laugh over a fizzy drink, a grandmother's steady hands sprinkling spice into a pot. Remember what was once common and what the loss of that commonness means. The sassafras tree still turns its leaves amber in autumn. It still holds the memory of filet and of tonic and of a home-sweet root beer. Whether those memories will be kept alive depends partly on archives and scholarship, partly on cooks and elders who teach the next generation, and partly on a wider willingness to balance precaution with preservation. We can honor both safety and tradition by documenting, by teaching, and by keeping a place, literal and imaginative, for plants that helped shape a nation's tastes. If you want to explore this further, share this video to help preserve the story, and check the description for sources and responsible reading on sassafras, saffrole, and the ethnobotany that underlies so many quiet domestic traditions.